Good evening, everyone. It's so great to be part of this programming. My name is Claire Douglas. I'm one of the founders for the New Fundamentals, which is a campaign consulting firm. And I'm going to be here tonight talking to you about what it means to right-size your campaign to set yourself up for success. And I'm just going to let's see if I can actually share my screen. Give me 1 second. All right. I hope that means everyone can see me. If anyone's in the chat, if you could just say, yes, we can see this, because I get a different display, that would be hugely helpful. We can see it. All right. Thank Keck moderator. And thank Luke. So I can't see you all, but hopefully you can see me. Feel free to introduce yourself. Tell me where you're coming from. As I do this, first intro part, it's always great to know that I'm not just talking to a blank screen in the evening in my home office. So thanks again for coming. Today, I'm going to be talking about right-sizing your campaign so that you don't get it wrong. Right-sizing your campaign is all about making sure you're setting yourself up for success. Making sure you aren't, over-promising and under-delivering, making sure that you're getting stronger over time. In order to maybe, you might not be able to win first year, but how are you going to structure your campaign over time to make sure you finally get to that long-term goal? So today I'm going to go through just some of the campaign basics. I'm going to share with you a federal case study of a campaign I ran, and then kind of go back to the campaign theory and process, right? So like from this tangible example, well, how did we actually figure that out and break it down? So to start, why do we run campaigns? Feel free to chat, fill in the chat. But ultimately, no matter what type of campaign, it's to get someone to do something that they otherwise wouldn't do. Otherwise, you could just pick up the phone and ask, or write a letter, or, hey, did you forget to mention this, whatever policy or whatever it might be? And the campaign itself is actually just describing a series of tactics and actions that are guided by a strategic plan with clearly identified resources that are enacted over a period of time. Those last two pieces, what are the resources that clearly identified and what is the time frame that you're looking to win, are actually important keys to consider when developing your campaign. And there's different campaign types. I know a lot of us who are participating at Gain Power, a number of us do electoral campaigns or issue campaigns, but we use that word a lot. And so it's really important that we know what we mean by that, because depending on who we're talking to, they might be thinking of a fundraising campaign or a marketing campaign. And so today, we're really going to be using issue campaign examples, but some of the lessons learned from those obviously are very transferable to fundraising, marketing, and electoral, and are actually very tied to electoral campaigns too. So an issue campaign is an organized strategic effort to educate and gain support from a voting or general public and the decision makers on your issue. Again, that's to get someone to do something they otherwise wouldn't do. And the types of power that helps drive decision making are broken down by legislative, electoral, regulatory, disruptive, and consumer. And so for, issues, we're really talking about, how are we getting our, votes on a particular policy, or are we, making good laws? So it's important to kind of just know that like your power is different depending on the type of campaign you're running. And right sizing is really just code for resourcefulness. This is kind of a graphic adapted from Marshall Gantz, who studies a lot of activists and campaign structures and organizing structures, and teaches it. God, I'm going to get it wrong. I think it's at Yale. But I really loved this diagram because it just visually gets across what you're up against. So for those of us in the progressive space, we actually don't have the power we need to get what we want. And for the things that we are winning, it takes a lot of effort. And some of the strides that we've made potentially like in previous years or even previous decades are now being challenged. And so we're using time, resources, and power even just to maintain the wins that we've done and actually slowing us down on the progress we want to see over time. And basically, if you see, if we're not in power, we're the small little circle. And the things that we want and the power, for us, the opposition, they're weighing us down, right? They're winning. They have the circle. And about, right sizing and being resourceful is about moving that strategic leverage so you can still win with what you got. So hopefully that makes sense. And I love his quote, strategy is about turning what you have into what you need to get what you want. And with that said, I want to tell you the story of offshore drilling in the Atlantic. It's a campaign I led up for a nonprofit organization. They're based in Washington, D.C., but it's actually international. They're in a dozen or so countries. Their primary work is saving the world's oceans. So a lot more on fisheries than you would think on like climate and energy. But offshore drilling was one of those issues in the organization that was really important. So I led up that effort. And it was about figuring out, how do I right-size the campaign? How am I going to think about the limited resources that I have to ultimately win big oil? For those of you that might not, there's so many issues and so many problems. I don't assume folks are familiar with the history of offshore drilling in the Atlantic. But basically, the Atlantic Ocean, people forget, was opened up to offshore drilling. And it wasn't until Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf that actually put a pause on further exploration and potential development in the Atlantic after that huge disaster. So once that disaster and we have kind of oil spill amnesia, right? The public wasn't, so scared of the oil spills, and the drill baby drill kind of narrative, resurfaced. The Atlantic was being, opened up back for offshore drilling. And so not only did we, have to like win a campaign, we actually had already lost it, right? Like it had already been open. It only paused because of this huge tragic disaster that killed 11 people and caused this huge economic, environmental and economic devastation. And so, these aren't to scale. The big oil bubble should probably go off the scale. But when I joined Oceana to take over this campaign, it was the end of 2013, the beginning of 2014. And the allies that were working on this were really limited to, national green groups and animal welfare groups. So, like the NRDCs and the International IFA, Federation of Animal Welfare. And so we really had this huge power imbalance, and it was about, figuring out what it looks like to end up winning. And so this is a very scary chart, and it has a lot of detail. And so I'm going to walk through it and then kind of break it down. But I wanted to at least start with demonstrating that you can take very complex issues with sophisticated opposition and break them down into something that's winnable over time. And in this case, sometimes you can even win earlier than you thought. And I'll get to that. But this is basically, this is a strategy chart. Many of you might be familiar. It's adapted from the Organizing for Social Change, which is a great book that's been one of my favorites for decades now. And I still use it as a reference. But there's a ton of different models of how to do campaign planning. And this is one that I really like. But I'm sure there's many other good ones out there. But basically, it breaks down your campaign into 5 columns. And so your first column is goals. The next is your organizational consideration, your power analysis, your decision makers, and tactics. So for us, we wanted to stop the expansion of offshore drilling. And my little part of that within the organization was focused on the Atlantic. And the intermediate goal was to get the Atlantic out of the 5-year outer continental shelf plan. And so what that is basically every president when the time comes for the plan to be updated, they get to decide when and how and where offshore drilling can occur in national waters. And so when it was it was under the Obama administration that they were updating this plan. And our short-term goal was to delay seismic airgun blasting. And there were permits that were issued for these large, geographical and geological associations and individual clients that basically use air guns, these high-powered air guns, to blast air deep, they basically do a huge lawnmower up and down the ocean over, this area is twice the size of California, blasting every 10 to 15 seconds and getting these readings to be able to, it's really not, they're, echolocating. And so they'd blast, the sound would come back, and they were able to do their magic and kind of figure out what kind of structures are deep beneath the ocean floor that might provide oil and other resources. And needless to say, if you're an ocean animal that depends on hearing much more than us land lovers, which is for sight, if you're deaf, you can't, or even just when there's these loud things going off, you can't look for food, find a mate, things like that. Strategically for offshore drilling it's the first step to offshore drilling. First you need to figure out where you want to drill so that they know how to, where to lease and, how to bid and so forth. So it was the first step to offshore drilling. And then I had to think about what kind of resources do I have to work with and to turn into what it is that I want. And so for us, my discretionary budget was $110,000 annually. And coming from one of my previous positions was at a local climate group, that budget was actually huge for me. I was used to doing everything on a shoestring budget. We do these state-based campaigns. A huge line item was print, just to do postcards and fact sheets. I might be dating myself as an organizer because we didn't have as much going online, but it was, thousands of dollars, not tens of thousands of dollars in budget. In addition, so for staffing, it was my job. So the campaign director, so basically 100% of my job was dedicated to this. I had a field manager or a grassroots manager. I had 4 organizers, a scientist, economist, a lobbyist, 10% of the legal team, 5% of the marketing team, and 30% of one of the communications director. And along with that, we had 1 intern or fellow. So when you're thinking about that against big oil, you're like, okay, I mean, it's not nothing. But when you're thinking about the opposition, it's still a lot. And then from an organizational standpoint, right? What does the board need? What does my boss need? What are the types of things that the organization wants that may not be directly tied to the campaign, or directly or indirectly, doesn't matter. And so one of the big things for the organization at the time was to build a reputation as a leader in the offshore drilling space and the climate space, in order to get new donors, in order to sustain that kind of programming, alongside getting new members and volunteers. Again, this kind of goes back to the point where 90% or so of the entire organization was focused around fishery management practices and illegal fishing and things like that. And so in a lot of ways, sometimes the offshore drilling campaign was a little bit of a, black sheep or what have you. And then, from internal considerations, I inherited a pretty dysfunctional team. It was a losing campaign strategy that the team at the time was incredibly bought into. There was no tracking system to evaluate what were good ideas, how to learn from them, how to get better versus bad ideas or the best ideas or what have you. And the issue wasn't a priority for leadership, which means that you didn't always have the same type of resources or other types of support services in the organization that other issues might have. And so why am I getting all into this? Again, it goes back to right-sizing your campaign. If you're not honest and open with, what it is you think, why you think it, I might have not made this public at the time. But if you don't know and you can't articulate what are some of the challenges, then how are you, either the campaign director or the campaign manager, or even just a team member, going to think about these issues and try to solve them in order to win? And so it's really important to think through that. And then how are you going to deal with it? sometimes like the biggest challenges in a campaign, a lot of times actually isn't necessarily your opposition, it's internal. Campaigns never win or lose because of lack of expertise or dedication or passion. They lose because of lack of execution. And right-sizing your campaign and understanding kind of what resources you have is a huge component on figuring all that out in order to set yourself up for success. And then here you can see that the power analysis at the time, there's too many big oil subcategories, so I didn't list them, but you get the point. For allies and partners at the time, we really just had green groups and animal welfare groups. But by going through this process, I also thought about like, well, not only is who at the table, but who needs to be at the table. How are we going to make our bubble against big oil on that graph from before, as big or if not bigger than our opposition? And so really focused on who is going to be most directly impacted by these issues. Sometimes you choose issues to work on, like I did, because I was doing this professionally and I'm passionate about the climate and energy. I've been doing my whole life, and I happen to be a scuba diver and for a lot of different personal reasons. But other times issues choose you, right? You where you live, if your water, you have clean, dirty air, or dirty water, or whatever it is. And so coastal communities in my head were, basically where this issue has chosen them because it could and would impact them. Local elected officials, tourism industry, and then of course, our environmental and animal rights friends. And the decision makers, ultimately, this was the president's decision, right? It's his administration, they get to decide, and we didn't have enough power. If you're thinking about, these are, whatever, about a dozen staff, even though Obama is only a few miles away, couldn't you just pick up the phone and be like, hey, could you just stop this? Like, that would be great. No, we didn't have enough power to get to the decision maker. And so we had to think about like, okay, well, if we took a step back, who has power and influence over this specific issue with the decision maker? And because it's in the outer continental shelf, so these are federal waters, that it is a federal decision. However, state governors that are in the zone get to weigh in, and they're part of the process of deciding when and where to drill. And so they were identified as our tier 2 targets. And then our tier 3 targets were members of Congress, particularly representing coastal districts, because at the time, again, over 60%, I forget the numbers, 70% were overwhelmingly supportive of offshore drilling. And so we were really focusing on like who are the members that we think we can kind of start from, and then along the coast that are going to be most impacted in their districts, and then move in. And then, but again, we were an international organization. We don't have a huge footprint. Many of you might not have ever heard of Oceania. We didn't have a lot of power influence over members of Congress, so we had to go down like another layer. So sometimes your campaign might not need to get like this down in terms of targets, but for national and federal issues, a lot of times you do. And so the 4th tier target was local elected officials and targeted in coastal communities. And so what we were like, okay, well, how are we going to have an opportunity to educate about the problem, discuss the solution, and get people to take action in some sort of meaningful way before it's too late, right? Before these decisions are made. So a lot of that focus in the first year was about how seismic airgun blasting is the first step to offshore drilling. And because those permits were going, we had that urgency, and we were able to use procedural steps in the Department of Interior's process. So it was under the Department of Interior, it was the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So under BOEM is short for Bureau of Ocean Energy Management process to create and take advantage of these flashpoints throughout the campaign to get people to take action and have these external deadlines to make sure that their voices were heard, because if they miss the boat, drilling's going to be there, and there's once it starts, you really can't stop it. And so our tactics were, we wanted to get over 50% of coastal municipalities to oppose offshore drilling and seismic airgun blasting. And we figured that out of, if we could get more than 50% per congressional district, we hadn't even figured out the numbers, like how many numbers of coastal municipalities there were or anything. I mean, this was a strategy charter developed at the, December, and then we launched in January, and I started, I think, in like October or November. So all that is to say is, like, you don't need to know everything until, before you get started into something that's like really, effective use of your resources. Because I do think sometimes, and people can overthink it and like just forget to get started because they're like trying to do some sort of crazy decision tree where sometimes the knowns are not even possible to know. And so the theory was, if we could get 50% of the coastal municipalities to oppose these practices, we could flip the members of Congress. And when I mean flip their positions. And if we could get enough members of Congress to flip their positions on this issue and, get involved or, become a champion, there's different ways that you can get elected officials involved. We could get the senators and the governors. And if we could get the governors, then we think we could put a lot of pressure on the president to reverse course. So in addition, we needed to diversify, big oil has a lot of interests, and they had a lot of reports and talking points around how this would be a job creator and this is good for your local economy. This is after the 2008 crash where jobs are a huge issue. The economy is a huge issue. It's a luxury to be able to worry about these things that aren't a problem yet when you have a roof over your head and you can feed your kid. But when you don't have those things, you might not have the time and energy and resources to be like worrying and working on these things. So it's really important to also make sure that like these issues, you can translate them to be applicable to people wherever they're at. And then we also wanted to get the Mid and South Atlantic Fishery Management Councils to oppose offshore drilling and seismic blasting. They actually have a little bit of power over like all things that happen in the outer continental shelf. It gets really wonky, so it wasn't a huge public thing that we did, but something to note. And if you're thinking back at the organizational gains, it was really important to be, a leader and have more visibility about working on this, since it was a newer area of work for the organization, and we wanted to like build it out and strengthen it and make it a program over the long term. And so media was important. And so we made some, goals. We didn't have a baseline. So they're round numbers because I made them up based off of educated guesses. But, we wanted to get 100 editorials, 500 letters to the editor, 1,000 earned media hits, 100 earned media hits in national papers. I broke that down from national and local because sometimes the local papers, and in this campaign, were much more powerful in galvanizing opposition to offshore drilling in the states that then built up to make it a national story. It was very hard to just get national news on anything, now is more true than ever. But in terms of if you're actually building and being resourceful and building for the long term, it was really important to not forget the local newspapers. Obviously, for those of you that are in states, you already know this, but it was actually, a little bit of a fight to be like, no, this is really a good use of our time and resources, is to get to these local papers that you've never heard of in DC. And feel free, if you have any questions, to put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'll leave some time at the end for some discussion. So the old framing, so that was my plan. So like, how did I get there? So like, one, a lot of the framing and issues was focused around dead animals and kind of your gut reaction of like, this is bad, and paid media and kind of like flashy things, which are great in terms of, gaining visibility or great, even just, attention on the issue. But we had like a multi-year plan in order to really win. We needed something more. And so previously there was like a great report that Oceana put out called "A Deaf Whale is a Dead Whale, Keeping the Atlantic Free of Seismic Testing." It was a great, report. It got us the basics of like why air guns, I never heard of seismic air guns. Like, why should we even care about this? Besides, it's the first step to stop, to oil, but also like, what is the rationale between, not doing it? And just to give you this was like a factoid that I still remember years later that really hit me. If I'm here in DC, if there was a seismic, air gun going off in my basement, you could hear it in Las Vegas, right? So sound travels really far, and that just like always, really helped crystallize it for me. But again, I care about, I'm a scuba diver. I care about whales and dolphins. It works for me. It helps galvanize the base, but it wasn't necessarily the enough framing to galvanize 50% of all the coastal communities around this issue. And then there was other kind of high profile short bursts. So this was, what if it happened here? The year after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, they ran a number of ads in like the metros in DC. So like around, so staffers saw people in the Department of Interior. So again, like great way to increase visibility. But if you're spending half of your annual budget on running some ads and publishing a report, that's it. You're out of your resources, and you want to create things that can build off and keep expanding over time. And so one of the first things I did is really wanting to like reframe the issue. Windwest Academy calls it like cutting an issue, right? So basically, what are all the reasons why we should be opposed to it, and like help make those connections. Did you do message poll? No, we did not do polling. So polling is really expensive, especially on like larger scales. I think we did a few very targeted polls around seismic. That I don't actually get into in this presentation because we did so many different things that you can't get to them all. But I just think like a lot of it was just like, it's the economics, right? Like the oil companies were killing us on like, yeah, but it's jobs and jobs. And we're like, well, it's dead whales, right? Like we needed to be able to take away their talking point that was very effective. And you could see it in, the op-eds and different communications from our opposition. And so we really wanted to know like, okay, like, well, what are those numbers? So the oil industry is saying, oh, we could get this much oil and it would create this many jobs that are technically available. And we just took their data and we said, okay, well, not just what's technically available, which means, there could be 1 gallon, but you'd have to like drill to just get 1 gallon. So it'd cost you millions of dollars to just get 1 gallon. Like, yeah, sure, you could technically recover that, gallon of oil or barrel or whatever it is, but is it, economically sound? And so we just took, okay, the economic numbers. So, out of the estimates of oil out there, what's economically recoverable? And then we compared that to what it would take in the same area for offshore wind. We did extremely conservative numbers because we knew we would get like hammered on it. And what would the job creation be? And so we found, to our pleasure, that offshore wind created more jobs than offshore drilling, and it created more energy. So twice as many jobs, twice as much energy. The tech moderator is saying the stream had cut off on my end. So if everyone's still there, do you mind putting a chat saying we can still hear you? We're here. Uh-oh, we might not be here. Oh, thank you, Deb. Okay, great. You can still, okay, everything's fine. Great. False alarm. It's alive. Great. So we found that it could be twice as many jobs and twice as much energy in the same area, right? Apples to apples. And not only that, but it wouldn't put at jeopardy the 1.4 million jobs and the $95 billion of gross domestic product that already rely on a healthy ocean ecosystem, mainly through fishing, tourism, and recreation. And if anyone's on the East Coast, like at some point you probably went to the Outer Banks, right? You've been to the beaches. Tourism is huge economic drivers in coastal communities. They're huge economic drivers for the entire state, like percentages. This is not a small industry. And so that became, a lot of the framing in terms of bringing in new people, right? We were in the North, but also in the Deep South. We needed to, identify messages that would expand our base and bring in new people into these issues. And like for those of you that have been camping for a while, there's kind of 3 essential ways to demonstrate your power. You show that a lot of people care about it. You know, a lot of people care deeply, and that can be represented in bringing them to like a place. And you're meeting face to face with your target with the right people. And so this is what it looks like. So lots of people, all of these names and along the coast are names of towns that passed resolutions. And then we started filling in on the right. You can fill in like the congressmen, the senators, and who flipped it. We also ran this ad, the coastal communities, the pretty one. We ran that ad locally here in DC to make sure that decision makers knew all this opposition was happening. So we had lots of people. We had lots of people in one place. We did a lot of petitions. We did public comments. We met face to face with your decision makers. We were at the Department of Interior. We were meeting with the director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. This is me with Mark Sanford, the former governor from South Carolina and former member of Congress from South Carolina's 1st District, who flipped his position on seismic airgun blasting. He called our South Carolina organizer after the 7th resolution passed. He's like, okay, I'm opposed to seismic airgun blasting. Let's announce this. And so then we did it in-person press conference and a number of things. And he ultimately ended up being a huge champion, not only for the Atlantic, but then later opposed Arctic drilling. And we'll get into election story about that too, if there's time. So the way that we ultimately won it is that we built people power, right? It didn't matter, if you're a Democrat or a Republican, like we built people caring about this particular issue. One thing I do when I, do a lot of traveling around campaign work is I ask the Uber or the taxi driver kind of like, what are the major issues? And when I first started flying down in South Carolina and like asking about energy or, this and the other, you get certain different answers. And by, a few years later, when I started asking about it, offshore drilling became like one of those indicators. And so when you don't have enough money to do extensive polling that Deb flagged earlier, like there's a couple ways that I kind of do free polling. One is with COVID, it's a little different. Some of these tactics that worked a few years ago don't work here, but I go to a lot of diners and I talk to a lot of taxi and Uber drivers, right? Because they're talking and working with all sorts of different people. And it's just helpful to kind of get that perspective. But ultimately we built people power and we won early. We actually got the Obama administration to remove the Atlantic Ocean from the draft 5-year plan in the draft, right? Like we wanted to get it out of the end plan. But we won it out of the draft, which was like months and months earlier. And then later, after we got it out of the draft and the final was done and it was all taken out, we got the administration to deny all of the pending seismic airgun blasting permits in the Atlantic Ocean, which was the first time the agency had ever denied permits. These things tend to be just like rubber stamped. And tactically, like what happened? We got over 90% of all the coastal municipalities to pass resolutions opposed to offshore drilling and seismic airgun blasting. So like over 100. We ended up getting over 1,000 federal, state, and local elected officials publicly opposing it, whether it was with their vote or they signed on to a letter or what have you. We got over 1,000 business interests. So at the time, we're talking about, small businesses along the coast, tourism industries, associations. And we got the Mid and South Atlantic to oppose, and we had over 160 environmental organizations for both the national, state, and local level that oppose offshore drilling. And this is what right? So this is what it actually looks like. So when you start building for the long term and you build out your allies, you're able to change that power dynamic that we actually, won and then some. And then something happened, you might have remembered. Trump got elected. And everything that we had just won out of the previous administration, we knew would now be under threat. And and within the first 100 days, he put it into his priorities to get these permits approved and open up the Atlantic for drilling. And at the same time, I would have, if I was strategically advising, which would have never happened, I would have said not to do this, but he opened it up everywhere. So now all of a sudden, when you had to like work all this way to get opposition along the Atlantic coast of people that directly would be impacted, he expanded it across Florida, across the Pacific. The Pacific expanded, wanted to open up off of the Gulf, right? So all of a sudden, there was a lot more people in play that would be directly impacted, where that issue kind of chooses the people that it would be impacting. So, from a campaigner standpoint, that just means like more people we can get to oppose this and to weigh in. And so, ultimately, he opened it up. But what we built was durable. I had actually left after, by the time we had won, it was like late in the year. It was Trump had, or when was it? Yeah, it was Trump had already won. He was taken office, but I had won for a while. So I was like looking for another job as campaigners. You win, and if there's another campaign, you keep going. Otherwise, you work on another campaign. And so I'd been, working on getting my next job for some time. And then when Trump got elected, and I had the choice. I was like, well, do I stay here and run this campaign, or do I pass off this blueprint? Organize myself as a job and help another organization and other campaigns win, which is what I ultimately did. But what we built was durable, right? It wasn't a paid media ad where it was great for the time and it did a certain tactic, and it was a good tactic, but it wasn't necessarily the best tactic, the most resourceful tactic, and something that's going to lead you, that's going to add up over time and lead you to not only the victory of your campaign, but make it durable so that you're not fighting this year over year, and or ideally fighting it year over year. But even if you do have to fight it year over year, you're winning it. And so Trump opens it up again for offshore drilling. Then people started pushing back. Florida, South Carolina, right? These very Republican states started pushing back, and Trump, as wasn't a good faith politician and only listened to his party. And so he only really listened to them. And so in fact, during the planning process, he took out Florida, he took out South Carolina, and everyone's like, we'll take us all out. It was very obvious. In addition, it became, good issue campaigns win elections, right? Like that's another way to make your issues durable. You want to elect good people, you want to enact good laws, you want to be able to like keep building on that to progress. So Mark Sanford, who was in the picture earlier, he actually lost his primary to a Trumpian primary candidate named Katie Arrington. And she was all, right in line, lockstep with Trump, pro-oil, pro-drill, offshore drilling. And, the people didn't want that, right? So when it came to Arrington, this is a coastal district that hasn't had a Democrat lead it in like decades, like over 30 some years. And so this was the first time that a Democrat actually won that seat because, of a number of issues, but like one of the biggest was offshore drilling. She ended up flip-flopping her position towards the end when like she was losing, but it was too late. People didn't trust her on that issue. It wasn't worth it to them to potentially permanently impact their lives, their livelihoods, these coastal communities, these tourist towns into oil towns. And they elected Joe Cunningham, which included an endorsement from the Post and Courier, and who highlighted offshore drilling being one of the factors that led to their endorsement. And there was a number of different electoral, wins at the local and state level on these issues as well. And then, Trump, what I said earlier, okay, we'll take out Florida. Like, it's okay. Like, don't get mad at me, Governor or Senator Rubio, whatever it is. And then he's like, okay, well, like, let's just put it all in so I can be the hero, which is then what he did because he was losing. It was like a losing issue in his reelection campaign. And then he even pissed off the oil industry, which had, says that they were blindsided by Trump's shifting environmental policies and expanded the moratorium from just his friendly states that voted for Trump to all of them. And then shortly after, seismic air gun blasting is dead. And then there's increased efforts to make a permanent ban on offshore drilling permanent, so that we wouldn't have to be fighting this potentially every year in the 5-year plan. And if you're thinking back at the graph that I love of Marshall Gantz, you can really see like all that led up to this arrow and that strategic leverage into changing what we had into something that we needed in order to win. All right. So any other, okay, great. Not a ton of questions, but I'll pause for a moment if anyone has a burning question before I go back to the theory. Okay, great. So one, people kind of sometimes forget this, right? Like there's so many problems out there to work on, so many issues to work on. How do you choose? Or like flip a coin, like really, like there's so many different ways. But I would argue, as many other campaigners do as well, is you actually have to be really thoughtful about the issues you choose, right? If you choose an issue that's unwinnable right now, and even like, and you don't have a path to build in order to get it win, like maybe you shouldn't go after that one. You need to break it down and choose a different issue so that you can get into a position where you can run this other issue. So well, feel free. If we have time at the end, I can give you examples of that. But basically, an issue is a solution or partial solution to a problem. And it's important to know, like, did you choose the issue or did the issue choose you, right? Like if I was for offshore drilling and I was a restaurant that depended on tourism, the issue chose me. I just maybe wasn't aware of it and or didn't understand how these decisions, miles off the coast would affect me and my livelihood. Is it winnable? Is it an issue that can build leaders? Is it easy to understand so that more people, they can't raise their hand and weigh in if they don't understand something? Is it an opportunity to show that collective people power actually works and that people can then realize it and utilize that over the long term, not only for this issue, but then to progress and build on that? And, does it raise money? Does it build your reputation, right? Like there's a number of different things. These are just like a handful, but it's really important to just think about like what is important to you and or your organization. In my consulting business, I help a lot of organizations actually articulate that. And we have like a weighted, a way that, we weight, like what are the criteria in which you choose issues? How much do we weight it this year? Sometimes you might put like a huge emphasis on like, well, we really need to raise money in year one so that we can be in a position to hire the right people or to do X, Y, and Z in year 2 or year 3. And so you can change how you weight the criteria over time based off of kind of the lay of the land analysis for your organization, but also on the issues that you're working on. And then once you choose that issue and you put all that thought into it, like, well, what's the process? Like, where do you go from issue to victory? And so, kind of basically it breaks down into like 3 major buckets. You're doing your strategy development and you're figuring all this stuff out. And it takes time, like show me months, right? Like research, you need experts, access to experts to understand the laws, the regulations, right? Like you got to do your homework. And then you need to figure out like, okay, well, what is it that we're going to do? How are we going to do it? How are we going to talk about it? Do we get our facts and figures straight? The oil industry has a ton of resources. If you misspeak or, have some misprint or whatever, they are just going to use that to discredit you and your organization. And so, and a lot of different, I mean, this is similar with a lot of extractive industries and a lot of the opposition in our field. But, you really do. What is our core message? Sure, we told our members whales and dolphins, right? Like that was what really mobilized them and why they were members of Oceana. But we also needed people that were beyond our members at Oceana to weigh in on it. So we did the economic and the jobs frame. And we had to build out our field plans, right? All right. Well, what are the towns we're going to go into first to pass a resolution? We strategically, because we were in the South and predominantly Republican areas, we didn't start with the most liberal areas, because if we got a liberal city, Washington, D.C., let's say we were in the blast zone, to pass it, that actually didn't necessarily increase our credibility in a Charleston, South Carolina, or in a Beaufort, or in all of these other towns. And so we also had to be thoughtful and strategic about like where do we go first and why. And in fact, well, if we have time, there's a million different stories. Remind me, for those out there, to tell you the story of Curry Beach. So you develop your core message. We put out our field plans. We had to build out our reports. We had to launch the campaign. We had to get all of those things, that collateral, or at least the basic collateral ready. And then you have to execute it, right? So like, what's working? What's working, what's not working? How do you, tweak it? How do you refine it? How do you make it better? And then you win or lose, and then you facilitate a debrief. Because there is a way, even if you lose, that lose a short-term goal, you can still win your long-term goal. And so this is that campaign framework from Midwest Academy that was that we filled out for the offshore drilling campaign. And another way to kind of think about strategy from that strategy chart is just like, how much power do you have? How much power do you need to win? And then what's your plan to build that power, right? That's how you get those balls, to be equaled and not outweighted. And so from that strategy chart, this is kind of like the big picture. So if you're thinking about your own issue out there and it's not offshore drilling, like, what do you actually want? What's your long-term goal? What do you really want? It might not even be just, a bill, right? It's like, I want to solve X, poverty, healthcare, whatever it is. What's your intermediate goal? And then what's your short-term goal that keeps the campaign going and hitting your intermediate goal? The reason why it's important to like do it in that order, because I've done this at different organizations, they always want to put the short-term goal first and the intermediate and then long-term. But if you're not anchored in your long-term goal, you might be choosing the, intermediate goal that's not necessarily the highest and best use of your time, right? Like, you kind of need to map out like, okay, here's the long-term goal and here's a suite of options for your intermediate goal. What's the issue that we should work on now that's going to help us get there faster, or that's going to help us win these other issues that are ultimately going to get us there to that long-term goal faster? So it's really important that you have that North Star, and that's the first and foremost thing in your thinking when you're choosing an issue, and then those short-term steps in order to get there. And then that organizational considerations slide that I showed you, it's like, how many staff, how much money, all of that. You really do need to map that out, right? I was consulting with a group and they were like, oh yeah, this is this huge priority for this organization and we want to do all these things. And then I started drilling into the resources and I'm like, so you're telling me you have 3% of a communications person, which is divided over 3 people. So like, really, and like, so half of that is just even keeping up with the issue to be able to meaningfully contribute as a communicator. You have this, whatever. It's just like, you actually have to map, like, write it down, list it out, because once you do, sometimes it just becomes really obvious, like, where those gaps are, where you need to, fill those in, or you might need to stretch out your timeline that breaks it down to like, this year it's this and this year is that. So that whatever you're doing in year 1, you're making conscious decisions that you're doing this to get you here that will end up getting you that win. So what type of organizational gains do you want? For the Oceana State Port, like, reputation and fundraising was really important because this was not a core issue that they tended to work on. But in your organization, or for your issue, it could be like, your organization really wants to get good at new skills. If you're a grassroots organization, you need to build a lot more leaders to help you get out there. You might want to get more donors. You might want to increase your reputation. It could be a whole laundry list of things, but you actually need to say, what are the 3 to 5 that are most important, and that I want to know that I'm going to get out of it by the end of the campaign. And I guess I'll share with you the flip side of that is, when I was a young campaigner, I didn't really like, yes, I worked on a campaign that won in my first year, but from an organizational standpoint, we didn't build the organization as much as we could have and should have. And to give you kind of a concrete example is that, sure, I identified a handful of like these really dedicated volunteers. We did all of these things. We ended up winning. We did constituent meetings. We went door to door. We did yawn signs. We like canvassed like a decision maker's whole neighborhood. So like we knew where she'd drive and she'd see all her neighbors were like, oh, Healthy Air Act. We did town halls, all sorts of things. But by the end of the campaign, like, we were all burnt out, including the volunteers. So a lot of the volunteers that worked with me in hand that I'm like still like in touch with, like were burnt out, and they didn't actually have that type of time and dedication that they wanted to for the next year because of that. So we should have spent more time building up a more sustainable volunteer structure so that we weren't, burning our volunteers out. And so there's also a way that you can win your campaign, but actually organizationally kind of lose, if that makes sense. So, and then there's internal and external considerations. Where are there conflicts, right? Like if you've been working in the, progressive space, like you've done coalition work, there are conflicts. Like, can we not like be polite and just be honest with ourselves? Like, where do we agree? Where do we not agree? Our coalition, and another group that I worked for, we had it in writing. Like, okay, well, here are all the things that we can agree on. Here are the things that we can agree on, but like, let's either not work on those, or, have some sort of rules of the road when we are, executing. And, okay, like we wanted these 4 things, you wanted these 3 things. Like if you're doing the 3 things and you go on, you're not part of the coalition because like the coalition is these 4 things. I'm thinking about that Healthy Air Act. So it's 4 pollutant bill, as opposed to a 3 pollutant bill. Anyway, so the point is that you really need to understand those tensions. How are you going to address them? If you can't, like, if there's just like no agreement, just set it up being like, look, if we get to this point where we have to make a decision on this policy or this issue, we're going to agree, disagree, and we're going to go our, separate ways, whatever it is, because you could spend all your time and energy trying to keep someone in the coalition that you're never going to keep them in. So it's just, again, just like you have to think about these things. You have to be honest yourself. You have to have those difficult conversations, but they become easier over time when you're just practicing being transparent and honest of where your organization is, where your policies are, and so forth. You need to think through your targets. It's always a person. I've worked with, people, and I've gone into new organizations, and I'm, asking my team like, okay, well, who are the targets? And I'll get answers like members of Congress, the Department of Interior. I'm like, no, that's not it. It's a person who ultimately says yes or no. You have to know who that person is, because you might be launching, a campaign and like doing all sorts of stuff with someone that has no power to give you what you want. And you're, wasting all of this time, efforts, and resources that aren't going to lead you to the win. And then you do your power analysis. And when it comes to elected officials, it's really, again, open and transparent. Let's remind ourselves, people don't just do things to do them, to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. If that was the case, we'd be much further along in a number of different issues. So, when you're dealing with elected officials, like, what is the power analysis for them? I usually tell people to like print this up and post it like on their monitor or whatever, on their car dashboard, if you travel up for work, whatever it is, just to keep it front of mind. But like elected officials, they want to get votes to get elected or reelected. They want to get money to help them get to get votes to get elected or reelected. And they care about their public image. Why? To help them get elected or reelected, right? There's a theme. And so it's just important to know what that is so that you know how to deflect that. And you list them all out. You can see at some point, like, well, if this is all who I have in the power analysis, just the green groups and the animal welfare groups, and that's not enough for my opposition, what you need to brainstorm, well, who else should be at that table, right? Who else is missing? It's not who can I get to agree, it's who do I need to agree to get what I want. I think that's a really important, piece of the puzzle. It's not who you can get, it's who you need. And great organizers focus on who you need. Mobilize focus on who you can get. There's a place for mobilization, of course. But if we're going to build our base, if we're going to win year after year, we also need to be thinking about like, who do we need to win? And then you need to, identify tactics to demonstrate that power before the decision's made, right? If you have all this power, but the decision makers don't know it, then they're going to vote the wrong way. They're going to do the wrong thing. And you'll still not get what you want. So demonstrating your power with a lot of people, petitions, letters, rallies, forums, public meetings, lots of people, getting those rallies, you're meeting face to face with your decision maker. And then over time, there's going to be peaks and valleys when you're actually executing this. So this is another Marshall Gantz um, graphic, but I overlaid it with, just the offshore drilling campaign, right? So the offshore drilling was open. Deepwater Horizon put a pause on it. So that's kind of that foundation period. And then, when we really kicked off into high gear, it was in the beginning of 2014, where we launched kind of our local resolution campaign. We identified a town that was going to put the resolution up for a vote. We ended up losing that vote, and we knew we would probably lose that vote because it was 2-2, and the mayor was the tie, and the mayor had been the one that sent the letter supportive of offshore drilling. But it was a way we got 300 people turned out in a town of 1,200 year-round people. So it was like a huge turnout to a town hall meeting that's usually attended by like a dozen people. And included in those 300 people were the mayor and other council members from the town up the beach. So we lost Curry Beach. The next week, Carolina Beach passed the resolution, and that became like our sparking event. And so then we went after Carolina, we went beach after beach, and we were able to show that momentum. And later, the mayor of Curry Beach lost his re-election bid to our Emily Swearingen, who was our lead sponsor for the resolution, right? So like it became a voting issue in that community. Right, so we kicked it off. We started building. It took us like a year to get like 20 resolutions over time, and then the next year we over doubled and doubled. Right, like we were able to exponential. We were able to get more mayors, governors, senators. We had all these peaks and valleys. We ended up getting to the mountaintop, and we achieved our long-term goal. Not thinking that Trump, would get elected and that this issue would be back on the table, but it didn't matter, because we were able to use what we built all over this time, the power that we built, and then just expand it, right? We went inland, we went coast to coast, and we were able to ensure that didn't move forward. And even just most recently, drilling bans were included in the Build Back Better bill. And so it could, it will be in a matter of time banned, right? And that will be like the more secure, longer term victory. And just to kind of recap some of like the features of what made of just in general effective grassroots campaigns, it's about being like strategic, stay focused, make sure you don't change strategy unless there's a huge lay of the land, right? There was a million different like bombs thrown in to the offshore drilling campaign. Oh, they have this scientist they're flying around and they're saying this and that, and it's like unless there's a lay of the land change in the environment, do your homework, make sure you have a winning strategy, you have your theory of change, and then stick to it. Don't get distracted, don't dilute that. Once you've kind of focused and you have a foundation that you can build from, then you can really keep going. Internally, make sure there's clear decision making and the roles and responsibilities are defined. This goes back to what I was saying earlier around campaigns don't lose because of lack of expertise. They lose because of execution. Who gets to say yes, press, go on the press release? Who is the public speaker? Who gets to say we're going to sign on to this or that? Like, who gets to make decisions internally to partner with this person or not? Like make sure and who's responsible for what, so that you can execute. And externally, don't confuse like national media with local power, right? So like just because an issue is covered in DC a lot, it might not have anything to do with the power back home. I'm actually a DC native. And what I've learned being from, the epicenter of national political power is that the thing that's most important is everything outside of DC. And, it's grassroots, it's people-powered campaign, like it's the people, right? Collective actions, it's us voters. That is power. Media isn't power. Flashy stuff isn't power. You really like the most effective grassroots campaigns, and how I think we're going to continue to expand and advance the progressive agenda is that we need to be centering long-term relationships with grassroots and grass tops. We want them next year, right? Like we're going to need to build these relationships, this trust. this power structure over time. We need to make sure that we're respecting local knowledge and relationships. There isn't necessarily a one size fits all. Sure, we have a tactic that we are deploying to make a national impact of passing resolutions, but our messaging changed, our approach, changed when we went from, city to sister city. Our, organizers on the ground would have to tell me, be like, Claire, no, I don't think we should go in hard. Like one city kept kicking the can by the, down the road. Like, we're not going to vote on it this month. It's next month. It's not this month. It's next month. It's next month. And we were like, well, do we bash them for not taking action? Like there was other things that we could have done. And sometimes you just, like a lot of times you do just need to listen to your local people and their gut reaction. You need to train and give power to leaders, right? It's your job as leaders in this space is to organize yourself out of a job. If, we don't have enough power. So, we all need to organize ourselves out of a job and bring in new people and keep building and building over time. And we need to make sure that we're not forgetting to celebrate with our volunteers and partners along the way. Yeah, sure, we love winning, but sometimes you might not win for years. And so by breaking down those milestones, not only, is it a good and fun thing to do, but it's really important to just regenerate and see wait, you can visually see that you're making progress to this lofty, big, goal over time. And people want to, feel that way. And so it's, just to kind of start closing down and opening up for questions, it's not just stop doing good ideas and start doing the best ideas. And what I mean by that is I remember being a young campaigner in a coalition meeting. We were just brainstorming tactics well, yeah, let's just turn out a lot of people to this demonstration. I was working in Maryland. So it was Annapolis and, people just throwing out different ideas, but it was really hard, especially for me as a young campaigner, to analyze, to understand, well, why is that a good idea or a bad idea? Or how do you figure out what the best idea? Because they all sound good. And does it just that the loudest person in the coalition wins and we're just going to do their thing? But if you don't understand kind of that theory and how you break down power and understand those dynamics, it's very hard to make your case. And I know I couldn't have done that when I was, a baby campaigner. But now I know how to do that because you need to understand all of this theory that goes behind it so that when you're in a coalition meeting or you're in with your colleagues, you're able to say okay, these are all good ideas, but now, okay, well, what's the best one? And it's not just well, I think this and I think that. It's well, what's going to get us here? How are these things going to help us build leaders or build reputation or build whatever it is, or organizational gains that are going to get us the biggest, that are going to make us the most resourceful and are going to get us the biggest gains in the shortest amount of time so that we can move on to the next issue, because we have a lot of work to do. And we got to just keep it on moving on. So with that, I do want to open up for questions from the audience. Again, I'm Claire. Here's my contact information. If you want to follow me on Twitter, if you want to send me out an email, if you even just want if you're running a campaign right now and you want a free consultation, go to my website. We can be reached at newfundamentals.com, and there's a contact us form, and I'll reach out and we can find a half an hour to chit chat. And I'm obviously on LinkedIn, and hopefully many of you are too. But yeah, do find me. I can't see any of your faces, so would love to meet all those that are participating in today. But yeah, does anyone have questions? Is anyone still there? I know it's almost 8:00 out here on the East Coast. Might be dinner time. If not, maybe if people are still here, I'm happy to show a video leading up to the victory of offshore drilling. The only question is, will the audio work? Let's see. Can people hear that? I'm hoping the tech moderator will tell me if you can hear this. I can't hear. Let's see. I might not know how to do it. I will share this in the chat if you want to, hear it. But there's very intense music. We're talking about the U.S. opening up for offshore drilling. We're talking about a movement building. We have local mayors and council members talking about this issue. We want to protect the coast. We don't want to make our oceans oil towns. And so you can see all of these offshore oil rigs and what they look like. We have Mark Sanford at the event talking about why he opposes it. We have a nice little graphic of how all these cities and towns are growing in their opposition. A number of different tactics built out. This is actually Queen Quet of the Gullah Geechee Nation in South Carolina. And the nation's along several states. Here's a demonstration in Florida. Claire, that's me, talking head. At the time we had, 85 coastal ministries. Anyway, so you can see that we have this huge waves at the, 600 federal, kept, by the end we doubled that. But we had all of this opposition building. And ultimately, our decision maker, we were aimed at the ultimate decision maker. So all of our major and national things, it's okay, it's Obama. Tell President Obama to protect our coasts. And then we had another victory video. And then I don't know if I'm able to chat here. Am I? Well, Google it. You can just Google this. You'll find it. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Well, thank you all for joining. I'll just give it one more call. Oh, now I wonder if my town was one of those municipalities. It probably was. What was your town? Are you along the East Coast? Because I think, had over 100%. Caroline, which town are you in? Oh, thank you, Caroline. I don't have any questions, but as someone in the coastal community, thanks for all the work you did. You're very welcome. And probably thank a lot of your community members and local groups. We help provide, we didn't have all the resources in the world. So we helped provide kind of that strategic guidance. We had some of the expertise. We figured out how best we could leverage our, inside knowledge of DC of who the decision makers were, when are these decisions coming, make sure that we're effectively communicating to the people, on the ground, so that they could make sure that their voices were heard. So it becomes something way bigger than any of us individually, for sure. Bradley Beach, New Jersey. So you were not in the blast zone of the first campaign. It went from the Cape May, New Jersey, to Cape Canaveral, Florida, which was the original seismic air blasting zone. But then once Trump opened it up, then you would be included in Bradley. So, well, thank you, everyone. I think we can end just a couple minutes early. Feel free to email me here. I'll put up my screen again if you want to reach out and get in contact. Oops. Hopefully you can see that. Oh, maybe not. There. Do stay in touch. I hope to hear from some of you. Again, you can contact me at claire@newfoundmetals.com. Follow me on Twitter at ClimateClaire. And we are also on LinkedIn as the New Fundamentals, and our website is right there, newfundamentals.com. But thanks again. Have a great rest of your evening. Keep up the great work. Thanks, Gain Power, for having me. Bye-bye.